The first major weakness is that respondents will tend to tell you that everything's important. So if you use a 5-point scale, you're going to get an awful lot of 4s and 5s. We frequently want to know, what do customers want, what's important to them, and how much would they pay? But those questions are kind of tricky to ask people to tell you. Qualitative has a very important role that I do not want to diminish. A lot of background qualitative should take place so that you can get the language, the topics that you'll need to address in your survey and in your conjoint analysis study. Without knowing the language that your customers refer to the features and gaining an understanding through qualitative of what are the meaningful things to them, it's very hard to be able to conduct a good quantitative survey. Traditional quantitative scales such as the 5-point and the 10-point rating scales have been used for many, many decades. And I'm sure you've all used them to probably a large degree. And most of you are very aware that the 5-point or the 10-point scale has a lot of weaknesses. The first major weakness is that respondents will tend to tell you that everything's important. So if you use a 5-point scale, you're going to get an awful lot of 4s and 5s. And if you use a 10-point scale, you're going to get an awful lot of 8s, 9s, and 10s, which makes it hard for you to discriminate between what things are really important and what's not. 5 and 10-point scales allow the respondent to be pretty lazy and just to straight line you, checking down the column of 4s or 5s and straight lining you. It's very easy for them to fall into that behavior. Another problem with the traditional 5-point and 10-point rating scales for asking people what's important to them and what they want is scale use bias. Depending upon our cultural background, our education, or our personality, we use scales differently. I might use the full range of the scale from 1 to 5, and you might want to just use 4s and 5s, and another person might just want to use 1s, 2s, and 3s. And this scale use bias is very prominent across different countries. So if you, for example, interview respondents in South America and in India, you will tend to find that they will give you a lot of positive bias towards the scale, a lot of 4s and 5s on the 5-point scale, for example. Whereas if you interview respondents in Germany or the United States, you'll tend to get a little bit lower responses. And yet you want to compare the results between the Germans and the Indians, or the Americans and the South Americans, and you want to be able to take away that bias, but it's hard to know how to do that when they're using scale use bias. And another really pernicious, really problematic result from scale use bias that not all of you are perhaps aware of is it leads to a lot of artificial correlation across the items when you ask for 5-point scales and 10-point scales on a lot of items. They just artificially will get correlated. And let me show you why that happens, and I want to talk to you about why that's a problem for you when you're trying to figure out how to optimize product and optimize price. Let's imagine that we were using a 5 and a 10-point scale. But one of the problems with the traditional 5 or 10-point scale is scale use bias. And let's imagine that there are 3 different groups of people. One group of people just wants to use ratings between a 5 and a 10 on a 10-point scale. The second group of people, let's say artificially for this example, just want to use 3 to 8s. And the third group just use scale points 1 through 6. And I've drawn random numbers between 5 and 10 for the first group, 3 and 8, and 1 and 6. And when I plot those between one item on my rating grid and another item on my rating grid, maybe I'm saying, how important is brand? How important is price? And if I use a 10-point scale and I plot them, and if respondents are answering with some pretty significant scale use bias, as I'm showing here, you'll get an artificial correlation even from this random data of 0.46. And when you have all these artificial correlations, it makes it look like everything is affecting everything else, and everything drives everything else, and everything's related to everything else. And if you try to run multivariate statistical techniques to tease out the separate effects of things, such as through regression, this artificial correlation is really going to mess you up and give you a lot of problems. That's why in conjoint analysis, we do not use the 5 and the 10 point scale typically in modern conjoint analysis.